So today, a guy in a Batman shirt is going to tell you about a principle that changed his life. This principle is called the 7 redemptive gifts. Now, in the previous video, we went over the first 4, that is, prophet, servant, teacher, and exhorter. And if you haven't watched that video yet, that's a great place to start. If you're like me and you like to skip ahead, then let's skip ahead. We're going to go on to number 5 today, and that is giver. So if you missed the first video, these types are sort of like the oldest personality type indicator test in the universe. This was established 2,000 years ago, around 50 AD, within the ballpark between 50 and 100 AD. And the premise is that there are 7 different types of people that God created. They can be found in Romans 12, and they are the prophet, servant, teacher, exhorter, giver, ruler, and mercy. And anywhere you look in the Bible where there's the number 7 and they go over 7 different types of things, that 7 pretty much always can be perfectly linked back to each of the 7 personality types in order. For example, the first 7 days of creation, each day of creation in order responds to the characteristic, or corresponds to a characteristic that God designed for each of the redemptive gifts. Same thing with the 7 items in the tabernacle. Same thing with the 7 curses in the book of Judges. Same thing with the 7 last words that Jesus said on the cross. Same thing with the 7 letters to the churches in Revelation, and so on, so on. So today we're going to go over number 5. The 5th type is the giver. And you might find yourself in one of these. I'll just leave it at that. So we have the giver. Some of the main characteristics of type 5, which is the giver, is that contrary to their name, they're not actually very into giving to just anyone. I mentioned in the previous video that the servant, they love to serve, and they will gladly serve anyone and everyone because they get their value out of serving. They feel valuable when they serve. Not so with the giver. The giver doesn't feel valuable when they give. In fact, out of all 7 gifts, the giver is known for being the most frugal of them all. The givers are the couponers. They're the people who want to go on Amazon for 5 hours to save $5. They're the people who will brag about the deal they got at the supermarket. These are the givers. And you might be thinking, well, if they're so frugal, then why are they called givers? And the reason why is because at first, the giver is frugal. And when they meet someone new, they're often standoffish. They're not one to make friends quickly. But once the giver finds a cause that they believe in, they will give 1,000% of themselves to that cause, 1,000% of all their resources. They'll give even more than they have. And so if you become friends with the giver and you become close, that giver will be someone who contributes more to your life than pretty much any of the other gifts. Whether it's financially or acts of service, the giver will continue to give to you only once the relationship has been established. Now, what is the hardest thing for the giver? Now, I mentioned this in the previous video, I'll mention this again here. The 7 last phrases that Jesus said on the cross each correspond in order from 1 to 7. Each one of them is the hardest thing for that type to do in terms of what they are born with. Some people, they've developed themselves to overcome this obstacle, but initially, this is the hardest thing for each of the gifts to do. Now, for the giver, the 5th thing Jesus said on the cross was, I thirst. And what Jesus was doing here is he was asking for something to quench his thirst. But it wasn't the wine that they gave him. He spat it out. But he was asking for help. He's saying, I thirst. And one of the hardest things for the giver to do is to ask for help. The giver prides themselves in their castle of supply. They pride themselves in their ability to bless others and not have to ask anything from anyone in return. But actually, in order for the giver to truly unlock their gift and who they are in Christ, they first have to overcome the obstacle of being willing to say, hey, I acknowledge that I need help, and I'm going to express that I need help to others. And once the giver can learn to receive resources and not just give resources, that's when they'll actually begin to be able to receive from not just their spiritual family, their mentors, but from God as well. And when the giver gains access to this unlimited storehouse of resources, that's when they're able to truly shine in their God-given calling, because now they're no longer limited to what they can do, but they have access to everything God can do. And so, let's see, some Bible characters who were givers. One of them was Elisha, the prophet. And Elisha was close friends with a guy named Elijah. Now, I want to mention something very important here, and that is that there are different relational dynamics between the different gifts. For example, if you place a giver and a servant in the same room and ask them to do a project, the results are going to be very different than if you put a giver and a prophet in the same room and ask them to complete a project. The most explosive combination out of all the gifts, if you were to combine two gifts, put them together, the most explosive combination is the prophet and the giver. If you combine them, put them on a project, the result will be either very good or very bad. But either way, it is astronomically explosive. Now, for Elijah and Elisha, it was good. You have this prophet Elijah who's very antisocial. In fact, Elijah was so antisocial that he attempted to bring Elisha under his mentorship in the most offensive way possible. He was like, God, I don't want friends. And God was like, I don't care about your desire, whether you want friends or not, Elijah. You're going to go take Elisha and you're going to be his mentor. And so Elisha walked up to him. He literally threw his cloak on Elisha, was like, we're leaving, and walked away. And Elisha, who was much more of a heart and friendly, relational person, went back and kissed his mom and dad goodbye and made some sacrifices, and then came on the way with Elijah. And these two ended up having a very powerful ministry together, but it was predicated on two things. One, Elijah chose to obey God, not very willingly, but he chose to obey God. And two, Elisha chose to have a big enough heart to forgive the offenses of the not so socially adept Elijah. And so when a giver is able to overlook the offenses of the prophet, that's one of the ways that they can really shine together. Another example of a really explosive combination, and we're going to get to some big ones in modern world, but I want to go still in the Bible before we go into modern world, and that is Esau and Jacob. Esau was a prophet, redemptive gift prophet. Jacob was a giver. And you can see that even when they were in their mother's womb, they were already beating down on each other. They were already fighting and trying to win. And it never really, calmed down until the very end of their lives when the prophet Esau, who was redemptive gift prophet, he overcame the difficulty for the prophet, which is to forgive. We talked about in the previous video, when he chose to forgive his little brother, that's when the blessings between their families really began to flow near the end of their lives. And so these are some Bible examples, but let's talk about some modern day examples of the explosive nature of the giver and prophet relationship. Now, different social groups, different countries, anything where you have a group of people will take on a dominant redemptive gift. And that group will have the flavor. Even though the individuals in that group could have one of the seven, that group has a flavor of one of the types. So we discussed how Germany yesterday is a prophet nation. That is their expression. And I believe God made them that way and that there's a good purpose behind that. But the enemy likes to take what God does and twist it for evil. The Jewish people are a giver culture. And so you have a prophet nation with a giver culture, and tension in World War II, we have the Holocaust. Now, an example of I'll give us a couple more bad examples before I go to the good ones. Another bad example of the explosive nature between the giver and the prophet is the USA, United States, prophet nation. Japan is a giver nation, and you have Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so this is the bad side of what it would look like, prophet, giver, just like Esau and Jacob. Esau's like, I'm going to kill my brother. Like, what point do you have to get to when you want to kill your own sibling? And not just like figuratively, because I'm sure many people have thought, oh, I figuratively do, but Esau was ready to stab him to death. He was a hunter. And so you have this explosively horrible nature, but you also have this incredible blessing that can be released if they walk in right alignment. Now, some examples of positive or relationships that were more productive is the United States and their relationship with Korea. Now, recently, Korea has been blowing up all over the map, and it almost appears to me like the Koreans are taking United States things like fried chicken and pop music, and they're making it better. Like, I don't know if you've ever had Korean fried chicken, but it's 100 times better than any Kentucky Fried Chicken or Church's Chicken, or I don't know what kind of chicken, Popeyes. Like, Korean fried chicken will forever be more juicy, delicious, boneless, and flavorful because they just improved upon the technology. Same thing goes with K-pop. Now, I'm not saying K-pop is better than normal pop. I don't listen to any of that, but I am saying it's taken the world by storm. And so we have the US, Korea partnering together, and now Korea is exporting things all across the world. I just gave 2 examples, but exporting things across the world, and it's a very productive and economic boosting in its expressions. We also mentioned Elijah and Elisha, and also negative example, but very productive in its expression, Nazi Germany and Japan. They worked together and somehow put the whole world in fright for, half a decade. And so 2 countries, and there was more people in the Axis, but they were the predominant players. So giver and prophet can be either really powerful and productive or really destructive. And I believe it really comes down to the maturity of each one. Normally, it's the prophet who is bulldozing forward, and the giver is the immovable object. But if they can lay down their differences and point themselves towards the same vision, then the prophet actually speaks forth where they're going to go, and the giver supplies the needs in order to meet those goals. So that's how they can sort of work together. I already mentioned the countries, giver countries. I'll just mention a few more. I already mentioned Japan, Korea. Philippines is a giver country. Indonesia is a giver country. And I think Switzerland is a giver country. If that's where the banks come from, then it's definitely the giver country. Now, next we have the ruler redemptive gift. Now, the ruler redemptive gift is one of the ones that I've studied the most thoroughly. And the reason being is because I myself am a ruler. And I didn't really know that I was a ruler until much later in my life. And the reason why was because there wasn't any real rulers in my community who could develop me in who I was. And you might notice one thing. You might hear me go through all 7 of these gifts, and you might say to yourself, well, that's interesting. I feel like I resonate with 2 of them really strongly. And that is very normal. In fact, for the first 2 or 3 years that I was learning about this topic, I thought I was an exhorter. I had no idea that I was a ruler, but I was persuaded that I was an exhorter because that's what everyone saw me as, and that's how I presented myself to the world. But the reason why I thought this wasn't because I was an exhorter, it's because my mom is an exhorter, and she's a very outspoken exhorter. And when I was born, without knowing it, I don't blame her for this, my mom decided that her way was the right way and that she was going to train me to be just like her come hell or high water. That's a bad phrase. Let's delete that. She was going to put this into me no matter what it took, and that exhorterness was next to godliness. Okay, that's also a bad way of saying it. You can ignore that one too. And so all my life I grew up with exhorter being forced into me by my mom constantly. And if you grew up in a family where one of your parents was more socially dominant, it's very natural for that parent to have forced their personality into you. So now you have 2 personalities. You have the one that you were born with, which maybe isn't very developed. And then you have the one that maybe one of your parents forced into you, and that's a lot stronger. And so you think you're this one, but in reality, this one comes more naturally. And I think the example that really helped put it all together for me is that you can take a puppy, 1-year-old puppy, and you can take a 1-year-old child. Both of them are living beings. However, no matter how long you try to teach a puppy, it will never be able to read and write because the genetic potential is not within the puppy to read and write. However, at the age of 5 or 6, the child will be able to start reading and writing if you teach them correctly because they have the genetic potential to do so. Now, for each of these gifts, they have things that they're able to do that the other gifts can't. And if you are born, let's say I'm born as a ruler, and my mom is an exhorter, then if I spend 1,000 hours trying out each of these gifts, the exhorter, because it's not in my DNA, I don't have the genetic potential to go as high in this category as she does. Whereas maybe 1 hour of spending learning the ruler, how to be a ruler, would be 10 times the output of if I had gone into exhorter. And so that's why, even though my whole life I was trained to be an exhorter, all the way up until just a few years ago, after only, like 5 or so years of learning ruler, I am now just as ruler, if not maybe slightly more, than I am exhorter, because it's within my genetic potential to do so. And that's the way that God made me. And so I'm ruler. Now, what are some characteristics of the ruler? The ruler is out of all the gifts, they're the most no-nonsense, efficiency, productivity. Some Bible translations translate the ruler gift as the administrator. And so they're very task-oriented, get stuff done, no nonsense. And while rulers are very capable of experiencing extremely deep emotions, they're probably the least emotional out of the whole group. When things go crazy, the ruler is usually the least bothered by it. In fact, the only thing the ruler is really bothered by is that they can't get the project done more quickly. Therefore, some of the weaknesses of the ruler include cutting corners, doing things incorrectly in order to push the deadline forward. They can become quite cutthroat, and if you've ever heard of capitalism gone bad, it's usually presented through the lens of a ruler who's doing a pretty poor job at it. And we'll go into some celebrities and popular people later who are ruler. But Jesus' last words to the ruler, before I go to that, I want to mention that God also works with each of the 7 gifts in different ways. And one of the ruler's superpowers, their abilities, is to do the absolute most with the absolute least amount of resources. And that's not just their gift, but God expects that of them. And from all the gifts, God is generally more harsh with the rulers than any of the others. And that's he made them to be able to take that beating. And they can actually thrive under pressure, which was really interesting to me because, as a ruler, I thrive under pressure. And so when I'm working with friends, I used to think, if I pressure them and push them harder, then they will get the job done more quickly. And you'll see soon that is not the case with all the gifts. But for me, that is exactly how I work. The more pressure, the more I'm pushed, the more stuff I'm able to get done. And so God works with the ruler in that way. Now, Jesus' last words, the 6th last phrase he said, was, "It is finished." And I think that's all I'm going to say about that. I'll let you draw your own conclusions as to why he said that to the ruler. Some Bible characters who were rulers. A popular one that comes to mind is King Solomon. King Solomon was all about finding the most efficient way, finding the cleanest way to deal with a problem, and he was really good at it too. He wrote thousands of songs, thousands of proverbs, and he was known for his techniques. Unfortunately, his desire to see progress in the end caused him to make some not so great covenants with other gods in the exploration of power. And so that was a sad, demise on his part. Another ruler was Joseph in the Bible, the dreamer. He was someone who saw Egypt was in shambles, and he took Egypt from where it was, and he expanded it, grew it, and built upon it. And one of the gifts of the ruler is building. Some people, they're gifted at starting stuff. Some people, they're gifted at finishing stuff. The ruler is really good at taking something that already exists and scaling it up, disproportionately. Originally, when Walt Disney first started Disney, he's an exhorter, and he was struggling financially. And his brother, who was a giver, was just barely managing to tread the financial waters and keep them afloat. And so you have this exhorter with all these crazy ideas, and then you have this giver who is, chasing him all over the place, trying to make sure that the ideas don't bankrupt them. But it wasn't until they moved to Anaheim where they met a ruler. And this ruler who partnered with them saw potential and said, okay, we're going to expand Disney and we're going to take this to the world. And that was when Disney really take off, was after they partnered with their ruler friend. So, yeah, one of the characteristics of rulers is growth. Joseph, ruler character. Another ruler character is Nehemiah. Nehemiah built the wall around Jerusalem, and if you recall the story, he did it in a remarkable 52 days. And his goal was to do it as fast as possible, even to the point of ignoring the civil complaints of the people. And so rulers can be very intense people. Some popular people in society who are rulers include some characters that, aren't looked upon so fondly by media, including Jeff Bezos. He is a ruler. Amazon is a ruler company. And Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin is a ruler as well. A ruler with perhaps more of a positive light on his life would be Alex Hormozy. He is someone who is very no-nonsense, down to business. He doesn't really care about the feelings. He just wants to see, how does it work? And if it works, well, do more of that. And the ruler perspective on life is actually very simple, very not complicated. And I used to get called out for that by people who loved me as a kid. They were like, no, that's too simple, Jesse. It needs to be more complicated. But it's not the way it was in my head. In my head, it was infinitesimally simple. And if I don't move on to the next one, then we're going to be unruler forever. But I will mention countries. Ruler countries include Russia is a ruler country, Ethiopia is a ruler country, and the United Kingdom. So is China. China is also a ruler country. And even though I probably gave more examples of ruler countries than I've given of others, ruler countries are actually the fewest out of all the redemptive gifts. Their characteristics that they're known for is they are often empires that have been around for a very long time. Oh, Egypt is also a ruler country. They've been around for a very long time and they stand the test of time. So those are some characteristics of ruler countries. Now, we were talking about relationships previously between the gifts. If you take a ruler and a servant and put them together, it can either be really productive or really abusive. Productive in the sense that the servant will get stuff done and the ruler will tell them what to do. But not so great in the sense that if you look at a historical example of a toxic ruler-servant relationship, we have Great Britain and their invasion and exploitation of India, a servant nation. That was not a, symbiotic relationship. It was very taxing and leeching of India and their resources. However, one of the most explosive combinations is a combination I've already mentioned, and that is the Isaiah 19 highway, which we haven't talked about yet, but God says that he's going to restore the earth after the end times with three different nations who have three different gifts, and that is Egypt, a ruler nation, combined with Assyria, an exhorter nation, combined with Israel, a giver nation. And who has those three gifts that I just mentioned a moment ago? You're probably thinking, well, there's only three people Jesse mentioned working together, and that was Walt Disney's company, and that's correct. When you combine a ruler, an exhorter, and a giver together, you get the most explosive, powerful combination of, world-changing stuff. And an example of that would be the British Empire. Now, we just gave a bad example of the British Empire. And while their deeds were very questionable, their productivity can be measured as they did conquer a lot of the known world. And the method in which they did that was the partnership between the ruler, nation of England, with the exhorter branch of Wales, the Welsh people. Combine these two, and yeah, they took over most of the known world. So this is taking a very long time, and I think I'm going to stop here and save the 7th gift, Mercy, for the last video. As much as I know about the ruler, I could probably talk as much or more about the Mercy. So I will see you in the next video, and we will finish the series off. God bless you, and goodbye.